Hi class, in this video we're going to set up our Ansible configuration file and set up the Ansible inventory. So I'm going to go back to my lab. I'm already signed in as my user account and I booted up all my machines by clicking all on. If you've come on and these machines are amber, I need you to turn all the machines on, go to the console, make sure they're all fully booted, and once they're all fully booted, shut them down. Once they're all shut down, turn them back on. If you walk away from your lab and you let these machines hibernate, what you're going to do is you're going to create a scenario where the machines aren't going to be able to synchronize their times with each other. And at that point, you won't be able to communicate with the host. Modern networks have a self-defense mechanism that says if the packet is 5 minutes off, they won't trust the packet. So at that point, you won't be able to talk to other hosts within your network. So if you let the machines hibernate, turn them all on, make sure they're all booted up, you have the login screen, then shut them down. Then once they're shut down, turn them all back on so all the machines are synchronized. So let me close this out. So once you get in, sign in as the DevOps user and open up a terminal. And you can see that I'm signed in as the DevOps user account. So I want to check Ansible, make sure Ansible is working fine because we just installed it. So I'm going to do version. And I can see that I'm using version 2.9.10. This was just released. And since I've been practicing on version 2.9.9. And there's been some changes since then. So I had to make some adjustments to the lab because things that were working before aren't working the way they did in the past. The other thing I want to do is if I do Ansible localhost, now I'm running an ad hoc command. So instead of doing automation, I can just manually run Ansible commands right here. So Ansible works by running JavaScript modules. You have a user module, you have a bunch of different modules, one to install software, all kind of things. So what I'm going to do is run the setup module. And what that's going to return is all the information about this host. And they're called Ansible Facts, F-A-C-T-S. I'm going to hit enter and it's going to generate something called a JSON file. I'm going to write that out. It's a JSON file. Basically, a JSON file is the way it's formatted. So it spit out so much data it scrolled off my screen. So what I can do is redirect that to a text file called setup.txt. And I can open up code and look at that file. And it's all the information about this particular server. It has my IP addresses that I'm using. This is for their virtualization. We're not using that. This is the IP that we're actually using. Here's my link local IPv6 address. It has stuff about Control F. I can do a search of this file, Ansible Python version. And I'm using Python version 3.68. Talks about SE Linux. You can scroll through here. You can see information about the network card. You can see what OS I'm running. You can see here's information right here on my virtual network card. You can look at what type of hard disk I have, what type of partitions that I have on that hard disk. You can see my MAC address. So it gives a lot of information about the host machine. In this particular case, the machine I'm on, which is my Ansible control host, rather than RHS2, DC, or my member server. Those are going to be Ansible managed hosts. This will be my Ansible control host, S1. I cannot have a Windows box as my Ansible control host. I have to host Ansible on a Linux box, but I can control Windows boxes and other things with with Ansible. So the next thing I want to do is we're going to create an inventory file. So I'm going to create an inventory file in a certain location, but before I do that, I'm going to cat etc Ansible, and then I'm going to type host. This is the default inventory file that's not really configured. You can see everything starting with the hash mark is a comment. So this is just removing, if you wanted to use this file, you would have to um, uncomment out the lines that you wanted to use. And basically, um, you're going to list all the machines that are part of your network. Now, I could use something to dynamically generate my Ansible inventory file, but for right now, this is the one that's the global inventory file. We're going to create another file. These instructions are going to be on D2L. So I'm going to create a directory. I'm going to do a list first. List long. This first letter tells you what it is. If it is a D, it's a directory. If it's a dash, it's a file. So you can see these are all directories. I have one file, which is that text file we just created. So I want to create a directory and then a directory inside of that. So instead of doing two commands, I could do it in one command. I'm going to do -p, and I'm going to create an Ansible working directory. Then under that, I'm going to create group vars, and I'll explain this later. So that's going to create two directories. What I'm doing is I'm telling make dir to create this directory right here. But the parent directory doesn't exist. So using the -p, we'll say not only do I want you to make this directory, but if the parent directory is missing, create that as well. Now I'm supplying the relative path, meaning I didn't supply the path from the root of the file system, which is /. So if I just put a directory name, then a subdirectory under that, it's going to create it in my current directory. So if I do a list now, I can now see I have an Ansible directory. I'm going to do a command called tree Ansible working directory, and it will show me under that is that subdirectory called group vars. If I did tree of my home directory, this is not root's home directory, DevOps home directory, I can see that under home DevOps, that's my home directory, I have an Ansible working directory, and under that I have a group vars directory. So now we're going to create a file under that. So I'm going to type code. Guys, I could use VI as my text editor, but this Microsoft product called Visual Studio Code is an awesome product. So I'm going to open up code. Then I'm going to go File. Actually, I'm going to close this setup document. So I'm going to go File, Open Folder, and I want to open that Ansible working directory. So at that point, everything I do will be on in this folder. This sidebar, I can collapse it or expand it by clicking right there. I could close out the welcome, so I'm on a blank screen. So I'm going to create a new file in this directory, and I'm going to start adding hosts. These are all the hosts that I want to manage in my network. And just to be transparent, I don't really need to put this host in here because there's automatically a host called localhost. It's implied, you don't need to add it, that refers to the machine I'm on. But we don't have a lot of machines in our network, so I'm adding this as well. As I start typing, you can see it's going to autocomplete. So I'm going to save this. I'm going to give it a name of inventory. And you can see that it's going to save it inside of that Ansible working directory. Just click save. And I can see that that file is saved. Okay, so I can't specify a group, but I can do this. Ansible inventory without a group name, just type list. So instead of returning a, I know what I'm doing wrong. I'm not specifying my inventory file. So instead of turning just text, what it's going to return is a JSON file. Uh, a JSON file is this special kind of format, and you can look up what JSON file format is. And this is called a dictionary item. You have a name, a colon, and then a value. So in this particular dictionary item, there's the name, and the value is another dictionary item. Here is a dictionary item. That's the name, that's the value. So in this particular dictionary item, the name is Linux, and the value is another dictionary item called host. That's the name, and the value for a host is these two machines. So basically, this is going to return a JSON file as opposed to just plain text. So if you're going to um, so if you're going to do a dynamic list or a dynamic inventory file, you need to have it return in JSON value so you can feed that into Ansible. So that Ansible inventory will generate a JSON file so you know what it needs to look like. And there's all kind of uh, stuff on the internet about JSON file format. And it's JavaScript object notation. That's what JSON stands for. And Ansible needs that if you're creating a dynamic host list. Okay, so I'm going to clear the screen. So the next thing we're going to do is create our config file. So I'm going to go into Ansible and run an ad hoc command called version again. So when I look at this file, or this output, give me 1 second. I'm trying to get to my notes. I can see that the config file that I'm currently using is etc ansible ansible.config. I'm going to look at that file, cat etc ansible. ansible.config. And I can see it's pretty much commented out. Everything in here is pretty much commented out. But this is the default location for all my um, Ansible configs. You can see that I have a default section. I'm looking for another section, but I can't find it. I'm going to cat it again and grep for, and I have another section called privilege escalation. What I did was I cat the file, and then I took the output of that, sent it over to a pipe, and sent it to the next, made it turn into the input of the next command, which was grep. So basically, grep does is it shows me any lines that have the word privileged in it, PRIV. So one of those lines was this section right here. So I have this privilege escalation. In Windows, if you want to run things as the administrator, you can right click and run as administrator, or you can use the run as command. In Linux, if you want to run something as uh, privilege execution, I can do SU to run something as the root user account, or I can just do sudo who am I, and that will elevate my privileges from DevOps to root. And if I do this on a Windows box using the run as command, it'll elevate my permissions. So I will be running as the administrator account. So those two sections are important. So what we're going to do is we're going to create our own custom Ansible file. So currently, which Ansible file am I using? Sorry, I'm still looking for, I'm just reading the textbook, so I want to try to stick to the textbook as much as possible. So by default, the config file that I'm using is the global config file for Ansible. So if that exists, that's the one I'm going to use. I'm going to go back to my home directory. You see how it represents my home directory as a tilde? So if I do cd tilde, it will take me to my home directory. So I could be in any directory that I wanted. Sorry, that was ACIT. So currently I'm in the Etsy directory. So if I do cd tilde, it takes me to my home directory, whoever I'm signed in as. If I was signed in as root, it would take me to root's home directory. If I was signed in student, it would take me to student's home directory. But right now I'm signed in as DevOps, so it takes me to DevOps home directory. So I'm going to do a list long. And you can see I have some directories in one file. Now I'm going to do a list A long, all long. If you just do a list long, it's going to show you all the unhidden files and folders. If you do AL, it'll show you all your files and folders, including the hidden files and folders. And you can see that it's a lot more stuff in this directory. So if you have a file starting with a dot, see this is a dash, so I know it's a file, and it starts with a dot, that means it's hidden. This right here is a directory. It starts with a dot, so I know it's hidden. So if I had, I'm going to touch dot Ansible config, that's going to be a hidden file in my current directory. So if I do a list AL, you'll see I have a file called .ansible config. So if you have this file, it will use that config file before the other one. So I'm going to do Ansible. I'm hoping this will work even though it's blank. So the first location that it's going to use is the etc Ansible config ansible.config. If this file exists, it will read this file as my config file before it will read the other one. So let's go in our home directory. Let's go into our working directory, Ansible working. Then I'm going to create a non-hidden file here. So I'm going to touch Ansible CFG. Then I'm going to bang AN. If I put a bang, then a couple of letters, it will run the last command that started with AN. So in that case, it was Ansible version. So now it's going to use this config file. So basically, I'm going to open up a new. If this file exists, it will use this as my config file. If this one exists, it will use this one. This is a hidden file inside my home directory. So it will prefer this one over this one. If this file exists, it will prefer this one over the other two. This means / is my current directory. So if I have something in my current directory, it would prefer that config file over the others. And lastly, if I have an environmental variable called so if I set this environmental variable, so every time I boot up, this environmental variable is automatically set, it would prefer this answer file over the other three. So currently I'm in my working directory. If I do a list, you can see I have an Ansible config. So if I go out of here, back to my home directory, what does two dots mean? That means the parent directory. It means go up one level. So I was in home, DevOps, Ansible working by going cd ... It brought me to home, DevOps. And if I do bang AN now, it would prefer the hidden one in my home directory because my current directory doesn't have this right here. So what I can do is if I have a bunch of different scenarios, I could create a bunch of different folders, put separate config files in each folder. And when I go into that folder, it'll automatically use that config file. So if I work for an MSP, a managed service provider, and I dealt with a bunch of different companies, I could create a folder for each company and then put a config file in that folder. And at that point, I would use that config file. And when I went to a different folder, it would automatically use another config file. So there's 4 different config file locations. the global one, the one for this user account. So if I'm signed in as that user and that file exists, it would use that one unless I had another one in my home directory or in my current directory. If that exists, it'll prefer that one over the other two. And if I had one configured as a global environmental variable, at that point it would use that one over the other three. So we have these three different config files that we could use. So what we're going to do now is I'm just going to close this out because I didn't save it. Don't save. I'm going to expand this. And you notice that, oh, before I do that, just to clean up some things, I want to delete this. rm tilde dot ansible.cfg. I want to delete that hidden file because I'm not going to use it. So I'm going to expand my Explorer window and I'm going to choose this answer file that I created. I'm going to show you my history. You can see I use the touch command. If I touch a file, it's going to update the access time that I last modified that file. So if I do a list, so I'm going to go into my working directory and do a list-al, and this was accessed last at 2146. So if I do touch Ansible and do a list long, I can see it was last accessed at 2151, which is the current time. So the touch command, that's its job to update this access time. But what if I touch a file that doesn't exist? It will create the file first, then update the access time. But it's going to create a blank 0 file. I'm going to delete that file. So I created this blank 0 file called ansible.cfg, and then I opened it up and it's just a blank file. So what I'm going to do is populate this file. If you remember in my global config file, I had a section called I'm just going to do a search of default. Defaults right here. So in my working config file, I'm going to create a section for defaults. Again, this content is over on D2L for you. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to specify default things that I want to use whenever I run commands. So normally when I run a command like Ansible, I'm going to use the module called ping. I'm going to do it against my Linux server, my Linux group. I have to specify my inventory file that's in my working directory, because otherwise it's going to use my global inventory host file. I don't want it to use my global inventory host file. I want it to use this inventory host file. And so it pinged both those boxes. RHS1 and RHS2. Those are the um, inventory hosts that were in that group. So I want to specify that the inventory I want to file, the inventory file that I want to use is called inventory. It's in my current directory. So this is it. This Ansible config file is in the Ansible working directory. And if I do a list, it also has that inventory file in that same location. So I don't need to put the path of where the file is. It's in the same directory as this config. I also want to specify that the default user account that I want to connect to those hosts is DevOps. If you remember during the setup, I created a DevOps user account here and a DevOps user account here. So that's the user account I want to use when I do things to host. And if you also remember, when we configured our setup, we created SSH keys, which allows us to sign in without a password. So I'm not going to have it ask me the password because I'm using SSH keys. In a production environment, maybe you don't want to do that. Maybe you want to force it to use passwords. But in this particular case, I just wanted to use my SSH keys. If you also remember, in my global config, guys, I'm doing tab complete, ANSI tab, and that will complete the spelling of the word. I'm going to do a search of, and you can see I have a section called privilege escalation. So I'm going to add that here as well. So you don't have to use every section, but these are the two common ones that you should be using. Which inventory file, which user account, don't prompt me for passwords. And when you're doing something administratively, you probably need that user account to be elevated to root or something like that. So what we're going to do is we're going to do become equals true, meaning that will work, guys. This will work, whatever format you want. One will even work. I just like to stick to lowercase. So when you connect to that remote host, do you want them to automatically elevate to the root user account, or we're going to say true? I could say yes if I wanted. That would work as well. Um, become method. How do we want to elevate that user account to the root account? We're just going to use sudo. And what user do we want them to become when they elevate? We want them to become root. And if you remember when we did our setup, we configured the sudoers file. So if you're part of the root, the wheel group, it'll automatically elevate you to root without prompting you for the password. Again, maybe you don't want to do that in a production environment, but for this lab, we have that all fixed up. So I'm just going to say false. We don't want to prompt them for the password. So now, when I did the ping of the Linux group before, it didn't um, it didn't work until I put that inventory. But now I specified in my config file. So it'll read this config file. Notice that it should be using this inventory file and then automatically do what it's going to do. So guys, if you see green here, that means it successfully ran the command, but it didn't make any changes. So it connected to those boxes, 1 and 2, but it didn't make any changes to those machines. If it actually makes a change to the remote machines, it becomes amber. So if it's amber, it was successful and made a change. If it's green, it was successful, but no changes were made. See, changed, false. No changes were made. If it's red, it didn't execute properly. There's an issue. So green, it ran fine, no changes. Amber, it ran fine, but made a change. Red means it didn't run fine. The problem is, guys, I have this command Ansible doc. I'm going to list. So it takes me into this little program that's kind of like VI syntax, and I can do a search of /win. I'm looking for anything in this list that starts with win for Windows. I'm going to hit N for next. N for next. I have all these commands for Windows boxes. If I keep going down, actually I'm going to do /win_ping. There's my win ping command. So I'm going to exit out of Ansible docs with a Q. So if I try to ping my Windows servers, this module doesn't work against Windows servers. It only works against Linux servers. I know that from experience. So it failed. What it's trying to do is it's trying to connect to that Windows box using SSH, and by default, Windows don't have SSH. So the default connection method is using SSH because this was designed for a Linux environment. So I'm going to try to do Ansible. I'm going to use the Win ping module as opposed to the ping module. And it's still going to fail. Number one is because it's still using SSH. Number two, it can't do sudo because that's not in Windows. It can't become root because Windows doesn't have root, they have administrator. So these variables don't work for, and that's what we're setting right now. We're setting variables. Don't work for a Windows settings. So what we can do is we can create variables that work with only one group. So earlier I had you create a directory called group vars. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new file. And in that file, I'm going to put Ansible user. I'm going to go back here. So here I just put remote user. But if I have a variable file, you have to put Ansible underscore in front of the variable name. So in my config file, I set variables by saying the name equal then the value. Up until a little bit ago, here's the problem that I was having earlier today, because I already did this video once and I had to redo it because they made a change with Ansible. In the past, I was able to put the variables right in my inventory file. So I could say, here's my global variables that I want to use from my inventory file. Then any variables that I wanted to set, I could set right here in my inventory file by doing another square bracket, but instead of doing colon children, I could do a colon vars, and I could set variables for that group that are only applicable to that group. Well, it wasn't running anymore. Um, in 2.9.9, it worked. In 2.9.10, Ansible was just updated a few days ago. So when I was practicing, I was using the older version. Well, this version, they changed it. So we have to do it this method. This method was supported in the old way of doing it, but um, in the new way, apparently this is the only method that's supported. You can't put the variables inside of your inventory file. Um, so we're just going to put them in here. So in this particular case, I want to connect for those Windows computers. I want to have the remote user account that I use. I don't want DevOps. I want administrator.contoso.com. Yes, you have to make it uppercase, but I can't use this format. I can't say variable name equal then the value. I have to put it in a dictionary format. In fact, if I wanted to be in a true YAML scenario, I can do that. Put the three dashes in front. When we're dealing with playbooks, we're going to be using YAML files. If you look, all YAML files start with three dashes. Any YAML file that you look at, you'll see the very beginning will have uh, three dashes. So to put this in a YAML file format, I'm going to put the three dashes there. So the next one is Ansible password, Ansible connection. So in your inventory file, when you're specifying any variable name, you got to put Ansible underscore in front of it. So instead of using SSH to connect, um, I'm going to use WinRM to connect to those Windows boxes. And the transport protocol that I want to use, again, is not SSH. I want to use Kerberos, which is the native way to do this in a Windows domain environment. Guys, if you remember that setup file, I had you run a script at the end of the Windows DC and the Windows member server that opened up WinRM and configured it so I can connect remotely to my Windows boxes. It also created a certificate, a self-signed certificate to encrypt data between this box and the server that I'm connecting to, the DC or the member server. But it's a self-signed certificate and I don't have any certificate hierarchy into my network. So right now I don't trust that certificate. So it will generate an error. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say use the certificate, but don't validate it. Just use it, trust that it's good. The other option is for me to set up a certificate server, generate a certificate for this purpose, and then um, I wouldn't have to use this command. So I'm going to save this file, save as, and I want to call this under the group var directory, my group name. So I have a group called, sorry, Windows. I'm going to save this. So I'm going to do tree of my current directory. That will show me my hierarchy. So I have my Ansible config file in my Ansible working directory. And under that, I have a directory called group vars and a file called Windows. Then also in my Ansible working directory, I have a file called inventory. So if I look at my inventory file, I have a group called Windows. So, so if I have a folder called group vars, then in that a file with the name of a Windows, the name of a group, those variables will be applied to any of those inventory hosts. So these will be the variables for DC and the MS server and would override variables set at this level or set globally. Like right now, I have a variable for connection set at SSH. It's automatic. That's a default connection method. Well, I'm going to override that and say for these two machines, any inventory host that's in the Windows group, use WinRN. I don't want to use the DevOps user account. I want to use the administrator account. I don't want, in this case, become equals true. I don't need that. I'm going to override that with this become. Again, remember, if it's in a var file, it needs to have Ansible underscore in front of it. So if you ever notice that if you're the administrator account in a Windows machine, you're actually signed in with the administrator account, it doesn't prompt you to elevate your privileges to the administrator account. If you know something called UAC Windows 10, that stands for User Access Control. And basically, every time you sign in as the administrator account, you don't run as the administrator account. You're just a non-privileged user. But when you see anything with a shield in front of it, let's just say I'm going to go to my control panel. You see right here, there's a little shield. When you click that, UAC is going to kick in. It's going to elevate me to the administrator account. But if you're signed in as the administrator account, it doesn't prompt you. The default behavior is if you're signed in as administrator, it doesn't prompt you. But if I created a user account called Brian and I added them to the administrator group and I was signed in as Brian, when I did something that required elevation, it would prompt me. The only account that it doesn't prompt is the administrator account. So in this particular case, we say become is set to false because we don't need it for this account. So I'm going to save that file. Then I'm going to run another ad hoc command. Ansible. The module I want to use is WinPing, and I want to use this for my Windows group. It was able to ping now. And there it pinged my DC. So let's do this. Here's another ad hoc command. Who am I? Windows. So again, the data that it's returning is JSON data. It's acting kind of sluggish. Guys, if it kind of pauses on you and you don't get any response, just go to another server, then go back. So it showed me every group that that user account is a part of. That's what the who is module, excuse me, the who am I module does. Now, if I didn't want to run it against a whole group, I could just run it against my member server. Okay, so I am going to end this video now. So what we did in this video is we created an inventory file and we also created a working configuration file. Our inventory file looked like this. We added some hosts. We grouped a couple hosts together. We grouped some other hosts together, and then we grouped multiple groups together. In our Ansible file, we set up the default for what we would generally use for our Linux boxes. And then we also set up a var file that will override the thing set up in the Ansible config, and it's named based on the group name. So if you have a group called Windows and you create a group var file called Windows, that would apply to all the hosts in that group. Okay, guys, the next video I'm going to do, which will end lab one, is I'm going to give you a lot more ad hoc commands that you can play around with. So that's it for this video, and I will see you in the next video.